So this is where I'm at the beginning of this video. I'm basically going to add all the inner components to the frame in this video. So the first thing up is that upper rail system is going to get a shelf. So that shelf is going to be made just like the panels before it, and I'm putting a 1/4 inch groove on the inner side of all those pieces. I made sure I marked the outer edge and top and bottom on these before I took them apart so that I wouldn't flip them around, because there's already tenons and grooves on most of these pieces. So there's that inner edge that you can see, and once it's realigned in the piece, I'm going to have to cut a groove into the leg, because the panel is going to have to be able to float in the leg, and since these legs are so thick, I could easily cut out a little triangle groove that panel can float in. You won't notice a gap in it, and it won't harm the structural integrity of the leg. On skinnier legs, there's other methods to do it, but on thicker legs, I find that this is the easiest way to account for the fact that you're going to have a floating panel. So once I saw my two lines, I could go through with a chisel and just chisel out that diagonal area, basically connecting those two mortises. And then once I had that groove, I could measure and cut my panel oversized to account for that groove. So I don't know if I explained this well enough in the first video. So once I have the oversized panel, I have a straight ruler on there measuring the total distance. Then I count those measurements, because you're probably going to be going to 30 seconds on this, and then I split the difference. So if it's 7/16 away from the measurement I need, which is on this was 14 1/4, I would count 3 on each side in order to get that equidistance cut that I had to make. That is a pretty important part of this, because you don't want a gap in the front or the back of your piece. And then once again, just like the other videos, once I had that outer perimeter marked, I can then set up my dado. This is 1/2 inch ply, so I only have to cut the top side. I'm going a 1/4 inch down, and these rabbets once again were in the 3/8 inch range. And then I could test fit. You could see I'm testing to make sure it fits in there, both of my rails. And then I'm going to have to cut a corner out of that plywood in order to put the leg on. I'm using my 3/8 inch key stock because I have 3/8 inch grooves on there in order to align that plywood of about where it would be with the leg on. Once that was in place, I drew a diagonal from my two edges. I didn't want to go past that outer mark, because then you would see it once the whole piece was together. But if I trim off that inner triangle, it will fit inside that groove of the leg, be able to move with seasonal humidity, yet have no visual gaps or spaces in the piece. So it's just a nice clean look to finish this off. So then I could put that other rail on, and then dry fit this entire thing together. So I have the panel in place, and then I could put the legs in place. And doing stuff like this in my shop could be a little difficult, so I decided it would be easiest to do this on its side, because I can't get 360 degrees around it. But once it was dry fit, I made marks on the back side. This is turning it to the back, because I'm going to cut 2 rabbets on that top and bottom rail in order to receive the backer. After that, I could finally glue up these panels. I wouldn't need to be able to take them apart anymore, so before I glued them up, I lightly sanded everything, so because once it's together, it's going to be much harder to glue. And then I glued them together just like any other type of glue up. These are actually pretty easy. You're really only gluing the mortises and the tenons together. You're not gluing that panel. And these were cut pretty well, so I didn't have to do a lot of shifting and maneuvering in order to get them square. A couple clamps I measured, and my angles were right. And then with that apart now, this is cutting the rabbet in the back. This is just a 1/2 inch rabbet to receive 1/2 inch ply on the 2 back rails. So when I go to put everything back together, I'll have that in place. So now it's time to add all of my cross members to these rails to reinforce the whole piece. So the markings on this don't have to be perfect. I just made sure to stay away from that little thick front section you could see right there, because that is going to demarcate the 2 sides of my cabinet. And I just went through and about every 12 inches made a mark on center, and that is where a cross member is going to be. So the best way to do this is I'm adding dados onto my rails, and those are going to receive the cross members. So what I'm doing is with those marks, I'm doing the top side first, and you can't see it in the frame, but I have a stop set on there. It's coming into the frame now. So I could safely get this to the right distance each time and then clear away from the fence as I approach the blade so nothing binds. So by setting this up on either side, I could cut one edge, flip it, and cut the other, and then those two edges will be equidistant from the end, which is great because it basically aligns the whole piece for you. So with those marks, I could cut this one, flip it, cut that one, and then those two are the same distance from the edge. And then since each piece had about 4 or 5 cross members, I could then slide the fence back into place, mark it right here. I'm sliding it back, marking it, and then I could cut this one, flip it, and cut the other one as well, which means that all of these pieces are going to be parallel, and when you go to put those cross members in, it pretty much squares itself. So that other piece I was just cutting with the lip is the one with the rabbit in the back. So in the center, I'm going to have a big cutout for a 2-inch vertical piece, which will mark the 2 edges of my cabinet. But I decided to put the cross members on either side of that piece, so that's why those 2 center ones are so close together. The other nice thing about this is I'm cutting the front rail and the back rail at the same time, so not only are the sides going to be parallel, but the front and back will be perfectly aligned as well, as long as your tenons seat properly in your pieces. So for the middle part was the hardest one because I couldn't go through the groove I cut for the shelf. If I cut all the way through that groove, you would see it on the top side of the piece. So for flipping it, at one point I had to lower it onto the blade to bypass that groove, and then for when I was coming up from the bottom, like on this one, I had to stop before it came all the way through the top. And then in order to get my pieces to fit, you'll see I'm going to have to chisel out that excess material. This cut looks a little dangerous on camera, but it really isn't. It was actually pretty easy to do. And then this was the same process for the middle one. I have that stop in place so I could cut my 2 edges on the front and the back, and then move it and cut my middle pieces on the front and the back, and everything is nicely aligned. And then it's hard to see where that lip begins in this camera view, but there's just a little bit of a peak you have to chisel away left over from that dado blade. You could see what I was talking about, how I didn't want that dado blade to go past my groove and into the top piece, because you would see it on the shelf. Then this is cutting the center piece, and once again I'm using the exact same method. It's set equidistance away so that those 2 marks are the exact same measurement from the left hand side as the right hand side. It's leaving me 2 little skinny pieces in the middle, but that means that my center partition is going to be perfect, so my 2 open pieces will be the exact same size, which is going to be really important when it comes time to make your drawers. So then, in order to utilize that wood left over from my faux pas on making the legs, I took those pieces and I ripped off the one miter so that I could use those as all my cross members. And then this is just measuring for those cross members. If you did this properly, these measurements will all be about the same, which is what you're looking for. If they're off severely, something's wrong. You should find out what it is before you proceed. Now in the center you could see they're about 15 inches, where on the edges they're about 14 1/4, and that's just because even though I milled up this lumber very nicely, everything bows out a little bit in the center. So you want to make sure to get these marks towards the edges where those tenons are seated in the legs, because they'll be the most accurate measurements. So all of mine ended up being about 4 1/4. So for that top rail that's 1 inch, I'm ripping down this leftover leg material into 1-inch strips, and those will fit in the dados. The middle one is going to be about 1.5 inches because once again you're not going past that groove. So then I could slide all these into place. The 2 edges fit nicely, but for the center, because they bow a little bit, you're going to have to use a clamp and then those slide in as well. So it will true up everything at the same time. And then once I had all those cut, the bottom ones ended up being 2 inches, which you'll see I wish I would have made them 1.5 inches as well later in the video. But this was one of those situations where the clamps were sticking out towards my face, and I'm actually surprised I didn't hit my head on them a million times. But I'm just going through and adding glue on all of my pieces and clamping everything together, and that's what it looked like at the end. So now those 3 shelves are all clamped together. So at this point, if my center panel fit, I could glue the rails to the sides, and then this main frame will be finally finished. You could see in here that that panel fit. It was a little tight, so I had to trim down some of the rabbets ever so slightly in order to get it to fit. I don't show that on camera, but having done this, I would have probably just cut the marks for the legs and the grooves, and once I had all my cross members in, cut the plywood so that I had a perfect measurement. It ended up working out, but hindsight is 20/20. I probably would have done the cross members first if I do this again and cut the plywood second. So everything did end up fitting, and I'm gluing all these pieces together now, so this whole piece will finally be one piece. I won't have to take it apart anymore. And you can't see in the video, but I have all these marked for front and back. There's so many cuts in them. It would be really easy once this is all apart to lose mark of those cuts. So you can see I'm utilizing some pipe clamps on the 2 edges of the plywood panel because they were flaring out a little bit. So in order to get them to fit back in the mortises, I used some pipe clamps in there. But with all these joints, minus my mistake with the table legs, this piece had come together very nicely. Everything was square, everything was lining up, and that's kind of a testament to cutting the mortises properly, cutting the tenons properly. If you do everything right, it just makes stuff down the line so much easier. So I let that set up overnight, and then I'm going to cut that middle partition. It's about a 2-inch wide piece, and then I'm going to cut laps on the top and bottom. These are about halfway through the piece, and they'll align with the dados I already cut in there, and this will snap right into place. So then I could just flip this into place and then make sure it's nice and flush in the front, because these drawers are going to be inset drawers. So if the front frame isn't flush, the insets will look a little odd. I checked to make sure everything was square, and then I'm going to flip it around and cut the back. You could see that where the backer, I have those 2 rabbets already made, and I'm just going to frame out the 2 edges with some strips, with some scrap strips of maple. So these are just little strips that will go right above those rabbets, so I have a complete perimeter around the back, and I'm just going to glue these into place. And my neighbor lent me a cordless nailer that I've used twice. This is the 2nd time. It's handy for these little jobs. I don't need one in my shop, but it was nice not to have to move my compressor. And then you can see the back fits into place, and I'll end up putting some screws in this. I'm not doing it now because I didn't have the right size, so then I could flip it to the front and then add the base. So originally I was contemplating not even putting a bottom base in because it's going to be drawers, you're not going to see it. But I decided to change the drawer slides I was using on this last minute, so I wanted a base for it. Unfortunately, that means that the flush cross members I had were too tall. I had to remove a 1/2 inch to put a 1/2 inch base in there. So luckily I still had my router out with the jig that I had, and I ended up having to modify it and put some runners on the bottom of it. But after I did that, it was pretty easy to cut out that 1/2 inch bit of material. So this is the base I ended up with. This is 1/2 inch ply, and in order to get it to fit, because my legs stick so far into the cabinet, I had to cut it short of the length, and also cut off the corners. But it's really sturdy. I added screws to this, and it's quite sturdy. So I'm using these Bloom tandem slides. I wanted to use these for a while. They're supposed to be kind of the premier slide to use. They're a little more expensive than the side mounted ones, but I wanted to give them a try because they're supposed to be superior quality. So in order to mount these, since these are only 12-inch slides, I had to put some vertical members on the side. I believe the longer versions of these slides you could mount right to the base, which would have been so much easier, but I had to get the 12-inch ones for this. So I made marks of where I wanted my dados in reference to where I had those slides set up. And I'm just going to cut some 3/4 inch dados in this base, so I have an extra reinforced joint to put 3/4 inch ply vertical pieces in place. So same process as before. I could cut those two center ones equally by flipping it so they're perfectly spaced off of either side, and then the two edge rabbets as well. Then I could put everything back into place and test it out. So then the strips that the slides will connect to, I'm using just some scrap 3/4 inch ply. I'm cutting it into 3-inch strips to give me plenty of room to mount into. And I was going to reinforce the bottom, but it's strong enough with the bottom glued into it to work, and you can see that's where those verticals will go, and those slides can be screwed right into them. I have everything lined up, and then once it was lined up, I could finally glue everything into place. So I could put my vertical piece in, screw the bottom in, and then glue those 3-inch pieces of ply in there. Now this could be done differently if I had planned this beforehand, but this could be a nice problem solve for anyone who has older furniture like this, where it doesn't have flush panels on the inside. Adding these dados and this plywood is a pretty quick fix for finding a way to mount newer hardware and older furniture. And that is going to be the end of this video. The next video is going to be making the drawers and finishing and all the final touches and everything like that.